Nathan, how you doing today?
Doing well. Excited to kick off this new series.
Yeah, people probably don't realize this. We've actually had several weeks off.
Yeah, a little bit of a break. You went on a nice trip.
I did. I went to see some family members out west. It was beautiful.
How was that? Where'd you go and what were some highlights?
Well, I went to see some family in Arizona and then also my daughter and her husband near Las Vegas. And did some hiking by myself. And then my daughter and her husband and I went to Death Valley, which is aptly named because there were very few living things there that you could see anyway. Bacteria, microbes, I suppose. But yeah, it was a very, very desolate place.
Wow. Wow.
But beautiful. The color of the rocks, the formations, the landscape was otherworldly, but beautiful.
Yeah, I haven't spent really any time except for my brother's wedding out in California. I haven't spent any time out west.
Yeah, I love it. It's very different than Indiana.
Always very jealous of the photos that you show when you get back.
Well, good. I like to make you jealous.
Nice. So today we are starting a new series.
Yeah, we are. I'm excited about this, but also feel like I don't have all my ducks in a row. So we'll see how it goes.
That's okay. That's okay. So the series is about knowing God.
Yeah.
And why did you want to talk about knowing God and what's your vision for the series?
This series can really be at the intersection of faith and philosophy because the idea that we can know God, that there is a God that we can know, is a very important philosophical concept. In fact, I would argue it's probably the most important. It has the most implications if there is a God or not. But even if there is a God, the question further down the road then is, can you know him? It certainly would be different than knowing just another fact. Furthermore, one of the reasons I want to talk about this is I think both non-believers as well as believers, religious believers, we tend to have a deficient view of God. So it's easy for people who have a very shallow, superficial idea of what God is to dismiss him, but also for religious believers who claim to have belief in God. If that belief in God is based upon a very shallow, uninformed understanding of who God really is, it will lead to a shallow, uninformed faith.
I remember one of my seminary professors saying how we think matters.
Sure.
Especially how we think about God. And I just remember as we went on in that course, realizing the implications that, oh man, yeah, how you think about God totally does matter. Thinking through the four great worldviews, I see the series as very naturally following that because it's like, okay, so if there is a God and if the theistic worldview is good and valuable and worth embracing, what next? Mm-hmm. Can we know God?
Yes and no.
Yeah. I like part of that answer.
I would say, yes, we can know, but we have to understand that knowing God is not like knowing other things that we may have knowledge of.
How so?
We tend to think of God as part of the furniture of this universe. Feel like, okay, we're going to apply the same methods of knowing, same epistemological method, to knowing God as we would know, for example, the moon or Jupiter or the bottom of the ocean or some historical fact. When you begin to think about the claim that the scriptures make, you realize that you have a problem in understanding the knowledge of God. God is not an object. God cannot be an object of knowledge in the same way that objects of this universe are objects of knowledge. So when we talk about knowing God, we're using that word knowing in an analogous way to knowing the things about this universe, but it's only an analogy. It's not quite the same. Because when you talk about knowing God, you're actually speaking about having knowledge of something that exists on the other side of the creator-creation distinction. So if Christianity is true, or Islam, or Judaism, matter, fundamentally there is one divide, and that divide is between the Creator God and all that He makes. So the things that He makes would include this entire physical universe, as well as spiritual beings, angels, demons, whatever else you might want to call them. All these things exist on this side of that great divide. Angels, clouds, Venus, history, the bottom of the ocean, Antarctica, the people within this world. All of us exist within this side divide. On the other side is God. God is fundamentally different than the things of this world. So the things of this world are all going to have this in common, that they are created by this God, and we have a similarity in knowing how to know about them. We have a similarity in how we know these things. But God is fundamentally different. So the things we experience in this world, for example, they all partake of space and time. The things we experience, like you, I see you as a person. You have a physical dimension to you. You have a location within space as well. You have a location within time. All these things are not true about God. He's fundamentally different. What's also true about you is that the laws of this universe, the laws of cause and effect, the laws of chemistry, the laws of physics, apply to you. You are bound by them, and that to some degree at least they control you. All those things are not true of God because he made those things. He's not bound by them. He made time and space. The normal ways that we know people are by using our rationality, including the laws of logic. And yet, I think we cannot apply those in the same way to God. Now, that doesn't mean that he's an irrational being. The laws of logic don't apply to him in any sense. But rather, he is the one who produces those laws. They're the product of his rational mind. He is not underneath it. And I think it's a very good question to ask, can God do things that to us at least seem illogical? Can God break what we would interpret as the laws of logic, just as we presume that he could also break the laws of physics when he does miracles? My point is not that God is irrational, but that he is beyond human rationality because he is the one who created it. So when we're talking about knowing God, we don't know him in the same way as the other things in this universe that are within this spatial temporal complex, as it were, that are fundamentally similar to us in the fact that they're bound by the laws of physics and the laws of logic and rationality. God is wholly different because he's the one who brought all these things into being. I find it very difficult to get this across, but that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I think that will take some time to let soak in. Because it's hard to think about that fundamental distinction because we live our lives considering other created things and other things. So everything that we experience is limited by the laws of physics and logic, time and space and all those things.
Yes. Let me give you one example. One of the great disputes within the Christian worldview is this whole idea of how can humans have free will if God knows everything? Part of the reason I think we're stuck on this is because the way our minds work understand that causality works one way. That is, causality in terms of time works one way. One thing has to exist before another thing to cause it. But if God is atemporal, so not just eternal in the sense that he's always been there, but exists outside of time itself and outside the sequentiality of time we experience, then there's no reason to think that for him, causation has to work that one way.
So him knowing things doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have free will.
Exactly.
So it's not an either or.
Exactly.
So you just solved that problem in 30 seconds.
Some people would just say I punted it. But yeah, I think when you devise a system that is strongly based upon the idea of certain ideas that God is sovereign over everything to the point where you denigrate free will and human causation to any degree, that perhaps part of the issue is that we're simply not in an epistemological position. We're not in the right position to understand causality fully.
Yeah. And just to bring it back to the beginning, that will affect Christian practice.
It will.
I mean, if you think that God knows everything and God is predestining everything, then that will certainly shape the way that we pray, because maybe we don't need to evangelize because if they're going to get saved, they're going to get saved anyway. That how we think really does matter.
Right.
So I imagine we'll get into God's temporal nature, perhaps, and these kinds of things later. But since we're just kind of introducing that, we don't.
Yeah, I can't wait to do that. In fact, my master's thesis was on the relationship between God and time. So, yeah, we could really get in the weeds on that one if you want.
I'd love to. Maybe I'll read that and we can have a whole discussion on it.
Oh, yeah, it's fascinating, riveting reading. It's
sure.
a page turner.
Yeah. Gets back to that question, though, of like differences between deism, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
If God is atemporal, can he interact? Can he make a difference, or we just wind it up and let it go? Okay, so it seems like philosophy is maybe one tool in our toolbox of how we can begin to think about the nature of God and begin to understand how we can begin knowing God. But I wonder if there are other tools in our toolbox. We can't know all about God. There's a fundamental difference between creation and creator, but there are certain things about God that we can know. So how can we how can we know God?
Yeah, you asked about whether philosophy can help in this or not, and obviously I think it can.
That's good.
Yeah, otherwise...
Glad you conceded that up front, because our listeners might be confused.
Right. And we'd be wasting our time and theirs, right? Philosophy, I think, can be a great help because it teaches us how to think about the right issues in the right way. And in particular, to ask questions that go deeper, second-order questions, you might call them. And by doing that, it forces us to ask and answer questions. Sometimes those questions can lead us to admit that we don't really know the answer, and that's a good thing to know as well. Philosophy can be a great help. It could also be a straitjacket. And what I mean by that is, I believe you don't know God primarily through the rational means or philosophical methods by itself.
What do you mean?
I believe that to know God, at least in the experience of myself and many other people through the ages, to know God in this way goes beyond what you can do in philosophy. It goes beyond what we normally think of rational analysis. Let me see if I can explain what I mean here. When we know things in this world, most of the time we're operating as an observer. So I'm watching some scene, and maybe it's unfolding in the park or a football stadium that I'm watching, and I am an observer of what happens. So if I'm at a football game or I'm at a basketball arena and I'm watching this, I have the knowledge, true knowledge of what's happening. I understand the play after it occurs at least. I understand what happens. I understand why they get points or why they didn't get points, right? So I have an observational knowledge of that. And really, if you expand that, that's primarily how we interact with things in this world.
Well, we're kind of limited to that because of our senses.
We are. Again, if I know a fact about history, what I'm doing is I am observing what has been taught about that. I'm kind of choosing to fit that into my knowledge puzzle somewhere. Or if I learn a fact about, say, the moons of Saturn, I am observing knowledge that's outside of me, trying to put that into my mind and what I think about things, how I interpret the world. That is an observational type knowledge. It's an objective type of knowledge, or at least it claims to be. But there's also another kind of knowledge that doesn't eliminate that, but goes a step beyond. You might call the knowledge of the agent. So an agent is not someone who's watching the football game. They're actually someone on the field doing the football game, making the results. Now, to extend that analogy to a human life, I believe that there is a way of interacting with this world that's not just observing, but is actually an agent within this world. And that part of what you do in that is actually knowledge. I'm not saying that very well. That when you interact with things of this world, you don't have to do so just as an observer, but also as an agent. And as an agent, you don't simply observe things, you choose things, you do things. And I believe that if our knowledge of God is simply we're thinking of that as an observer, then what we're thinking of rationally is a set of ideas about a person or a thing or a concept that we call God. But going beyond that, there is also a type of knowledge that only comes as an agent. There's not a perfect analogy to this, but I can think of my own wife, for example. There was a time when I knew her only observationally, right? There was a time where I knew her as, okay, this is her name, this is what she looks like, this is what year in college she's in, right? I know certain facts. And yet there comes to be a time where I also not only know that she is my wife, but she is my wife because of my choice. There is a knowledge that comes about that's true about her, but only because of the choices I have chosen to make in regards to her. That's closer to what I'm trying to get at, and not just myself, but I think Kierkegaard talked about this idea a lot, that this agent type of knowledge, you could call it a subjective type of knowledge or an existential kind of knowledge. Subjective here doesn't mean arbitrary, like your teacher is subjective if they favor one student over another, but the idea that I am a subject who is making this claim to knowledge. I'm not just an observer. I am a subject, and I have to understand that when I'm talking about God, it's not enough to have just an objective observer type of knowledge because you're talking about the issue of faith.
Yeah, it makes me think of Martin Buber's two different kinds of relationships, like an I-it relationship where there's a subject and an object versus an I-thou relationship where there's two subjects And relationships with people should be I-thou relationships. It's not just about knowing about somebody, but actually knowing somebody.
Actually, I think that's very apropos, and I'm glad that
Yeah.
you've read him a little bit. Yeah, I think it's very much along the same lines.
I think another thought I had is I have some experience overseas and learn Spanish. In Spanish, there's two different words for know, two different verbs. One is saber, which basically means to know about, and the other one is conocer, which is to know somebody. So I know about President Biden.
Okay.
But I know you. And it's a huge difference. It's a huge difference knowing somebody than just knowing about somebody. Some people I've heard, maybe it's Augustine or St. Anselm, talked about faith seeking understanding and how in order to have this I-thou relationship and to know somebody or know God instead of just knowing about God, you kind of have to begin with faith. Do you think that that's true, that you can't really begin to know a God that you don't believe in? Or do you think that it go the other way around?
Yeah, the question in Christian philosophy and theology has been, do we believe in order to understand, or do we understand in order to believe?
Yeah.
And obviously,
it's a good way of putting it.
So I believe both of those are true. I believe that when I say I understand in order to believe, that is a true statement. That I don't believe simply without understanding, without a rational capacity for choosing one as intellectually more valuable and coherent than the other choice. So I don't choose apart from my reasoning ability. But at the same time, I think the other is true. And the other, I think, probably is the one that most people don't develop enough, is that I understand because I believe. So when I come to a certain place, my understanding can give me the ability to discern what are the options and why one might be better than the other. But at the same time, really understanding God and his ways comes only after you make that choice. So first, I believe we do choose to believe because we understand something. But the fullness of our understanding comes after we believe.
So that's really good, because no matter where the starting place is, this discussion about know God or God's attributes or that kind of thing can be helpful. Because if you are already coming from a perspective where you believe, and this can help you learn more about God, which can shape your affections and your posture toward him and your actions and all of that kind of thing. Just like once you started a relationship with your wife, you got to know more about her, which led you to love her more because there was more that you knew about her and more that you could love.
Exactly.
But then from the other perspective, if somebody listening has not started believing in God, then this can still help them get to know more. Okay. So we talked a little bit ago about philosophy and how we can get to know God through philosophy. I wonder if there are other tools in the toolbox, so to speak, that can help us know God.
Let me list out a few ways I think that we can know God. And these are going to be complementary. And the first way that I think we can know God is through the natural world. So scriptures talk about the heavens declaring the glory of God. And
the heavens?
Uh-huh.
Meaning like heaven?
No, the skies.
The skies, okay. The skies declare the glory of God?
Uh-huh. Yeah. And then in Romans chapter 1, Paul talks about all people should be able to see that there is a God because of what he has done. So he says there is some sort of knowledge we can have about God simply by observing what he has made. The idea being that we look at the cosmos and then we draw the conclusion that it's more logical to believe that there is a being who created that, and then think about how powerful that being is. So I should make a distinction here between the cosmos as being a sign and the cosmos as being a proof. I believe Paul was talking about it being a sign, that when you look at this physical world and this physical universe that we are in, it could point us towards the fact that there is someone who created this and brought this about. That's different than a proof. A sign can be something that says, look towards that instead of just this, where the proof is, okay, because there is this, therefore there has to be this. And so the cosmological proofs of God are a different issue than a cosmological sign pointing towards God, at least for our discussion here. So one way we see the incredible world, and if we choose to at least, we can interpret this not only as being beautiful and wondrous and mystical and powerful in itself, but also as pointing toward the wonder and the mystery and the power of the one who created.
Yeah. So that verse that you're talking about is Romans 1:20 says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. That makes sense to me that, if you think about an artist who creates a work of art, say a painting, you can see a little bit. It takes some deciphering and some thought to think through maybe what they're thinking or what's going on in their mind or their heart, what they value or that kind of thing.
Right.
So it would make sense that we could look around at creation and see color and order and see beauty and see, some of these things that might begin to hint at the nature of.
Right. So I think it's a legitimate type of knowledge. So theologians and philosophers would call that a natural theology or a natural revelation. Natural theology would be building ideas about God based upon that.
Mm-hmm.
Natural revelation just means that God reveals himself through the natural world. There are some theologians who rejected that, especially Karl Barth. But for the most part, I think that's pretty non-controversial, that there is at least a sign that nature is pointing toward God, and we can have some knowledge of God. Now, is that knowledge sufficient in itself? No, because it doesn't show you anything about necessarily the heart of God. It might show you his power, something about his appreciation of beauty and mystery, but it doesn't show you much beyond that, perhaps. That's general revelation, but more specific revelation would be through the scriptures. So that would be the second way that we can know God, is what he reveals in the scriptures, primarily in, for us at least, what we would call the Old and New Testament. And they tell us about this particular God. They tell us about his interaction with human history, or at least some people within human history. They tell us about his goal. They tell us about his attributes and his nature, what he is like, what he likes and what he doesn't like, what he values and what he doesn't, especially in terms of human choices and values. So that is the second type of knowledge, is the scripture.
Yeah, I like that. I think that that's tough because scripture so much of it is written in narrative form.
It is.
So it's not like there's a book like first and second attributes.
First and second attributes. I like that.
It'd be a good one. Yeah, these are God's attributes. But yeah, I think you certainly see that the narrative arc of God's redemption, he is good and he is drawing people into relationship with himself. His attributes like hospitality and grace. You certainly see that. And I imagine that will be part of moving forward as we get into some of these specific attributes. Scripture will be one of the ways in which we understand God's character.
Right. Yes. And then the third one is going to be less clear, but I believe that we know God, at least as Christians, through the incarnation.
What's that? That's a big word.
Right. You know what it is. But yeah, I'm glad we're explaining for everyone, because some people might not. Incarnate means to make something physical that wasn't physical, basically. Incarnate means that God himself walked into this space-time matrix, walked into this physical universe in the form of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. So that's what we are claiming. And that through that, then, he lived a perfect life. He taught us about the true God. And then he died a vicarious death. Vicarious means that he died for somebody else, not because of his own sins or what he deserved. So the reason I want to bring that out is because, to me, in one sense, it's part of our scriptural knowledge. So it's part of the special revelation that is the scriptures. But at the same time, it is a piece of knowledge that if you believe that God in love incarnated the Trinity in the form of Jesus Christ, and that he died so that we could be reconciled to God, that changes everything else you read in the scriptures, as well as really in nature, I think. So to me, it's a special kind of knowledge because it forces a reinterpretation of the other.
Yeah, that's one thing that's pretty unique to Christianity.
Yeah,
you're not going to find that in Judaism or Islam.
No. And I think our Jewish friends probably get very frustrated with us how we interpret certain Old Testament passages or Hebrew Bible passages.
Well, because we view it through a Christological lens.
Yes.
I'll just bring up a couple sections of scripture that I think about. Of course, John 1, where it talks about the Logos, or the first principle, the Word becoming flesh,
right,
and that being Jesus. And there's Colossians 1:15, which says that the Son, or Jesus, is the image, the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for in him all things were created. When we look at Jesus, we see God. And then I really like Hebrews as well.
Can you go ahead and read the rest of that?
Yes.
Colossians 1:15 through 20.
Here's Colossians 1. I'll just read 15 through 20. It says, the Son, talking about Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead. Resurrection there. So that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace with his blood shed up.
Right. Now, if you believe that, that changes your philosophy about nature.
Say more there.
Well, because nature has a point then. This physical universe that we're in didn't just happen. It's not the result of chance. It's not the result of necessity. It has a goal and a purpose somehow wrapped up into being this arena in which God brings all things into fruition and fullness under Jesus Christ, including reconciling us to him, and that we have a share in that. So there is a purpose. There is a goal for which all things were created. And if you believe that, then you have a fundamentally different understanding about the universe because you understand the reason.
Yeah. All things were created by him, which, by the way, is so fascinating because in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Right.
And that New Testament passage is saying that the Son was also creating. So Jesus is God who created creation, but also created through him and for him.
Right.
So that purpose, yeah. So there's another passage here. It's a little bit shorter. In Hebrews 1, it says that the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. That's so neat. When you look to Jesus, you see God. It gets to the doctrine of the Trinity, which we'll get into as well.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, I love what you say, that we can understand God by looking to the incarnation, because in Christian theology, God never acts in a way that isn't Christ-like.
Yeah, God never acts apart from his purposes.
So understanding that means everything.
Yeah, so to sum up so far, I believe there is a legitimate knowledge we can have about God, at least his power and existence, as at least being a rational belief based upon the world around it. We have the scriptures that we also believe give more specific testimony to who God is. And then we interpret both those things, especially by the incarnation cross of Jesus Christ. Those are, in a sense, objective in that you and I can share them. So they're objective in the sense that they're not something that's distinct to me as opposed to you at different subjects.
Sure, those can be facts that we can just kind of adhere to.
Right. And people could disagree about the facts, obviously. Many do.
Right.
But there are facts outside of us necessarily.
But they can be treated as an I-it relationship.
In some sense, yeah. But I also believe that there is a knowing that is internal and subjective. There is an agent type of knowing when it comes to knowing God. I believe that each person within their own journey, especially if they're seeking God, can have a knowledge of God that is valid for themselves, decision-making for what they value, what they choose to do with their life, based upon their own experience of God, whether it's some dramatic answer to prayer, whether some help God has given, some insight that he's brought through his word or through other things, or maybe something beyond that. There is a way in which I know about God because of an interaction. And that interaction is going to be very personal, so it's going to be very subjective. It's going to be something that I choose to understand in a certain way. But to me, that is a type of knowledge. It's a subjective type. It's not a knowledge that you could necessarily evaluate or judge, because I could never really explain it to you fully. But for me, as a subject, as a person, to me, that is a very real type of knowledge
No, I think that there's a natural analogy here thinking about human relationships. I mean, I have a friendship with you. I have a friendship with your wife. So I know your wife to some degree, but not like you know her. Your relationship with her is much more personal by nature of being married. You're talking about a knowing that goes beyond just knowing facts to actually having some sort of personal, subjective experience with.
Yes. And that subjective experience then actually is a form of knowledge as well.
So it's not to be discredited.
No,
I'm with you. I think that's a lot of what it's about.
I don't think if someone's evaluating it for their own selves, probably my experience doesn't necessarily count too much in their own evaluation of that, but it does for me.
I think that it can. I mean, I think that on a past episode, in the Faith in Doubt episode, we talked about sometimes when you maybe don't sense God's presence or you're doubting, you can still, I think you said, stand on the backs of giants.
Or borrow your faith.
Borrow your faith. That sort of concept of within community, even when my personal experience is lacking or something, you can still see the faith of others, and that can be meaningful.
I think we can have legitimate knowledge about God these ways. But at the same time, we're talking about knowing in a different sense. So I want to come back to this idea that the goal is not to know God as an object of knowledge like we know other things. No. The goal is not to know God like we know historical fact, like we know a scientific theory, like we know some part of this universe, like I might know the city of Franklin that we live in. I believe that we need to internalize this as an existential choice of who I am, what I view life is about. It has to be the knowledge not only of the observer. I have to choose, if I believe this, to let this change my life. So that's what I'm trying to get at. I think it's good. It's all talk about knowing God. So in coming episodes, we'll talk about knowing God, especially in some terms and some categories that will be very familiar to philosophy, infinity, and whatnot. And I think those are going to be very helpful. At least they've been very helpful to me in my own spiritual journey. But the goal is not to know facts about God, but to use those as a way to actually know this God in an existential, relational way.
Well, that'll be really good. I'm really excited for this. I think that this is a perfect discussion that's kind of at the intersection of philosophy and faith. Because like you said, some attributes will be very familiar to philosophy, and then some of it will dip into theology, but all for the purpose of knowing and loving.
Right. Exactly. All right. I think that's all I have, unless you have any more questions.
That's good. Sounds good. Thanks so much.
All right. See you next time.